What's my purpose?
Am I here?
Where did I come from?
How come there's so much evil in the world?
I'm scared.
How do I know what's true anymore?
Hey kids, here's episode 2 in my new series on Dad Answers the Tough Questions, and I'm going to be joined with Abdu Murray, who's a fellow dad as well. And so just to get his perspective, and I do a lot of talking myself, but we really want to hear from him because he brings great information, I think, that's valuable to you. So in episode 2, we're going to answer the question, there's so much evil in the world. If God exists, why does he allow it? That's a fair question, right? That's one of the questions I had. And so hopefully you'll get enough in our discussion to kind of spark other questions and, when does it end? But hopefully we'll get to the point where you have enough of your questions answered that you'll understand why I landed where I landed. Hey, I just wanted to give you a quick heads up. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a few topics that might not be appropriate or suitable for younger audiences. You can watch the video yourself and then decide for yourself. When we start talking about tough questions, naturally things are going to come up that might be a little bit sensitive to people. Just wanted to warn you, so please use your own discretion. Anyway, let's join Abdu for our second episode in the series, Dad Answers the Tough Questions. So as we dive into our second question, this is the second episode of this new series that I've started. The second question is, and a lot of these questions, again, I want to reaffirm in my own mind that my belief stands up to these questions too, because I still have, live things with an open hand. I want to understand. I'm not, here tight-fisted. I'm holding on to this no matter what. Again, going back to our first episode, I want to know what's true. And so the second episode is based on kind of around this question of there's so much evil in the world. And you hear this from people. There's so much evil in the world. And I'll acknowledge there is so much evil in the world. If God exists, why does he allow it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
very heavy question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Abdu.
Yeah, and it's a big one. It's probably, I would say, the single biggest objection to belief in God generally, and even Christian theism specifically. Because we talk about a God of grace and love, and a God who is all-powerful, who can do anything, a God who is all-knowing, so he knows everything, and a God who's all-loving, so he cares about everything, and yet he allows suffering and evil to exist. And it suggests that either he's not all-powerful, he's not all-knowing, or he's not all-loving. Or more likely than not, he doesn't exist. That's usually the way the objection works. And it's powerful. I feel the force of it. I feel the weight of it. As someone who talks about the credibility of the Christian faith, I think about it often. But in the past 16 months, I've thought about it a lot more. And the reason is because evil has touched my life very specifically and very powerfully. Oftentimes philosophers and theologians will talk about this issue of suffering, and they'll call it the problem of evil. And I get it, it's an academic issue there. But when you've been touched by evil in the way my family and I have been touched by it, it's no longer a problem. Rob, it's a scandal. It is a scandalous thing that an all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing God would allow evil to take place when he has the power, the knowledge, and even the concern to stop it. It becomes a scandal. Now, I say that, but I want to make sure I preface this with, I've come to resolve how the scandal itself is actually dealt with because of how it was in my own life. So the first thing we need to establish before I get there, because what's important is that the reason why I say that is in October of 2024, 2 men impersonated utility workers and came and conned their way into my parents' home in my neighborhood. And when they did that, they lured my father down into the basement under the pretense that they're looking for a gas leak. And they surprised him from behind, assaulted him, and murdered him. They took my dad's life. And my dad is the Incredible Hulk to me. I have so many stories about how strong and powerful and brave my father is. So they took him from behind, and they assaulted him with weapons and did what they did to him. Then they went upstairs, and they assaulted my mom. She survived. And all for the efforts of getting money. And they got nothing out of it. Now, both men were found and tried and convicted and are serving life sentences. And that's what scandalized the whole thing for me. I always felt the scandal whenever I felt someone else touched by evil and suffering. But when I experienced it myself in this way, it was no longer this abstraction. Evil was real and palpable. And so I proceed from that when I answer this question. But let's back up first and ask this question, is that if suffering and evil exist, do they disprove God's existence? And the answer is the exact opposite, actually. Because if we're saying that human suffering is objectively bad, goes back to that objective thing we talked about in the first episode. If it's objectively bad, that means that there is a standard, an objective standard for good and evil that exists outside of human opinion. And that is a moral thing. It's morally bad for these things to happen and morally good for compassion and justice and mercy to happen and these kind of things. Well, those are moral things. And if those moral standards exist outside of human opinion, then they don't depend on human opinion, which means that they have to be transcendent. They have to be personal because only persons are moral. The microphone I'm talking through isn't moral. The camera I'm speaking to isn't moral. The air I'm breathing isn't moral. Concepts aren't moral. Like love isn't loving and justice isn't just. They don't do anything. Rather, persons are moral. But if morality exists outside of human opinion and transcends human opinion, then the morality, which has to be grounded in a person, to be transcendent, has to be grounded in a transcendent person. And who does that sound like? Well, that sounds just like God. So for us to judge things as good and evil and have a standard of good and evil by which to differentiate between good and evil that transcends us, the morality that standard is based on has to be based on a transcendent person. And that is what God is. He transcends this world. So evil doesn't disprove God's existence. Rather, it actually proves God's existence. So that's the philosophical answer. There's a little more of a, I think, an existential answer, a more personal answer for that. But that's how I would start off the response.
Well, first, I just want to say I'm so sorry. That's, yeah. I mean, I think we all. Well, I know we all suffer at to varying degrees, and that is really tough. You know, that is just super tough, and I'm so sorry that that happened to your family. So
thank you.
Can I ask? So, you live near Detroit?
I do.
Yeah. Did your parents live near you too?
Yeah, they live in my neighborhood actually.
Okay.
I was actually on a flight to Dubai to speak when I found out, and I had to fly back 16 hours of a flight with a layover, with that news sitting in in my heart, and my family having to deal with it without me there. So it was tough. Yeah, but they live in my neighborhood.
Yeah, and it was a random thing, or
no? They planned it. No, they planned it out.
Okay.
My dad owns a jewelry store, and one guy was a customer, and the text messages were played, and it's actually national news. You can look up all the detail if you want to. And they said, hey, this is a jeweler. He probably has money in a safe and jewels in a safe in his home, so they planned to rob my parents. Of course, my dad didn't have any such thing. And they got costume jewelry and a couple of bucks out of the whole thing. And took my father and my mom's sense of safety out of the world. And so that evil was real, and it was planned. And that's the part that's really disturbing, is that the robbery itself was planned.
Yeah. Wow, that's difficult because I mean, I have my answers for suffering and some of that stuff, but it seems kind of a little bit shallow because I don't know how else to say that. I just want to be empathize or
Yeah.
sympathize
Yeah.
with the fact that I haven't been through something that tough.
Yeah.
It's that difficult. I've been through, I've lost loved ones and I've, seen injustice in the world
Hmm.
and why is this being allowed and all that. Sorry, I've got a notification saying that my computer, it wants to reboot on me. I don't
Oh,
want
oh, don't do that.
that.
Don't do that.
So
Well,
one,
if I
one
could,
of the things that,
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I was just
Yeah,
going to
you go.
interject and say, well, one of the things that's important, I think, when we experience suffering like this, or we talk to somebody who's experienced suffering, is don't worry about comparisons. Suffering is suffering. Someone who suffers the loss of a loved one because they die slowly from a terminal illness suffers in a different way, but no less intense. There's no scale for this stuff than someone who loses a child suddenly to a car accident, or like
Yeah.
me, a father who was murdered. Suffering is bad, and it's just the kind of thing that we all experience in different ways. And so we don't have to do the comparison thing. What we can do is empathize, and I appreciate your empathy. And this goes back to a biblical reality: is that in the book of Job, Job suffers seemingly more than anybody else outside of Jesus in the Bible, it seems like. And his friends come alongside him, and they do the right thing. For 8 days, they sit in silence with him and just are present. And then they decide to open their mouths and offer opinions on why Job suffers, and then they ruin everything. But before that, they were just present. Just be with people as a comfort. Does that answer why God allows it? No, but it does help you to help someone else walk through what might be the worst time of their life.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's very, very well said. Because yeah, you can't get into a comparison game because
Right.
you got, I don't want to wish that on anybody.
Right.
Something evil, so that you can say, oh, you went through something worse than I did.
Yeah.
But so the way I've always kind of answered it with, some of the other minor suffering, I guess, with my own kids and trying to help them understand that people aren't. So I even talked to my neighbor about this at one point a few years ago. There's an elderly lady, and some people were stealing her mail, and I said, I am so sorry. I said, they're not going to get away with it, though. They think they're getting away with it, but ultimately, the story's not over. I think we tend to judge God based on what's happening now,
Yeah.
and instead of what's going to happen in the end. Everything's going to be made right, and the Bible does say that will not the judge of the earth do what's right? He will, and we tend to. I firmly believe that based on the years that I've grown in my own faith and understanding that, hey, that doesn't seem fair. Why is that person going through that, or what have you? But I think when you have an eternal perspective on your life, which I remember hearing that when I was as a young Christian, and it really resonated with me because it's like we're judging God and judging everything based on this little window of time that we have, when eternity is forever, And so I think if you can keep that perspective of things are going to be made right, they will be made right, and we can trust that they will be made right. And I think of It's a Wonderful Life. I love the movie It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you have to go through the tough parts of it, in comparison to other things. Again, not to compare, but there's some struggles that go through, but it makes it so beautiful at the end because of that. If
Yeah.
you don't have that in the story, you just kind of have this bland story, and why is it so great at the end?
Yeah.
So I like to look at it kind of like that, where if you through the middle of the story, you'd go, this is a horrible movie. Why am I seeing Uncle Billy give away the money to Potter, and Potter's doing even better now?
Yeah.
He already owned the whole city basically, and or the whole town, and now he's even doing better and taking advantage. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I like to compare it to that.
Yeah.
from
Well,
my
you
own
see
life.
this right in the scriptures too, and I want to give two examples of something, because I think that word trust you used is extremely important. Extremely important to see how the scandal is itself resolved. The first thing is you look at the Bible, you look at the story of Joseph. So Joseph is given a revelation by God, but then he tells his brothers, and he makes the mistake of sort of pridefully telling his brothers. His brothers grow to hate him and fall because of jealousy. They throw him into a pit to die, but then they decide, okay, we're not going to let him die. So they go back only to find out he's not in the pit anymore. He's actually been sold into slavery. So Joseph didn't really do much that was bad. Gets sold into slavery in Egypt. Then he manages to find his way into the service of a high official of Egypt. And then he's accused of a crime he didn't actually commit, which was attempted adultery. And he's thrown in prison because of a crime he did not commit. And then while he's in prison, he tells another guy who's also in prison, but he's a high official, he helps that guy. And the guy says, I promise when I get out of here, I'll put in a good word for you. Well, the guy forgets about him. So Joseph spends way more time in prison than he ought to spend. Everything is not going his way. It's a terrible story. And then finally he gets out. And then finally he wins favor and curries favor with the Pharaoh of Egypt. He becomes second in command, only second to the Pharaoh of Egypt. And why? Because a famine overtakes Egypt and the land of Israel, and everyone is doing terribly. But Joseph is in a position, because of his wisdom, he's able to store up food, and the family that rejected him unknowingly comes to him for sustenance. They think he's dead, but they come to him for help, and he is now in a position to help not only Egypt, not only his family, but also an entire other nation. So thousands upon thousands are saved because of Joseph's suffering. And he says to his brothers who sold him, who started the whole process, he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That doesn't mean that God causes the evil. Human beings still have free will, and we still do it. But God, who knows the end from the beginning, he knows what has happened, what is happening, what will happen, and what would happen in certain circumstances. He can orchestrate a world where we act freely and we still have our free will, but he can orchestrate circumstances so that an ultimate good will come out of it. We have that example in the Bible, but we also have it in the person of Jesus. And this is where the scandal comes in, Rob, for me. I was asked very recently, I was speaking at MIT, and a woman came to the microphone, and her mother was murdered by the Taliban. And she had to flee. And she was worried about anger and hatred and all these things, and how does she harbor her life away from that? And does my faith as a Christian now help me in some way deal with my own suffering, having I disclosed that my dad was murdered? And here's what I think the answer really is. It is a scandal that such things are allowed to happen. But in the Christian faith, we have a foundation for believing that God can use suffering for a greater possible good. You know, we don't know, and you said it before, we just don't know with our tiny piece of the pie, our tiny slice of visibility, a keyhole with which we look. We can't see the whole room. So we're not in a position to say God doesn't exist or God isn't good because he lets us go through this suffering. We just don't know all the things he knows. And even if we did have access to all the things he has access to, our limited brains might go nuts with all the information. We might not be capable of comprehending it yet. That's also a theory. You know, it's just that God works in mysterious ways. Anybody can say that. A Hindu can say that, a Muslim could say that, a Buddhist could say that, someone who believes in God but not a non-specific version of God can say God works in mysterious ways. He uses suffering for some greater good. It's a nice theory, but it comforts no one. But here's what I want to offer. This is the scandal part. The scandal of suffering is dealt with scandalously in the gospel message because God doesn't just let human suffering seem like it might be for a greater good. God enters into the world and suffers himself. The Father gives the Son who is also God, dies on a cross and pays for your and my sins because I can't afford to pay them. But the one who has no debts of his own, Jesus, can pay them. And so he suffers what I deserve to suffer so that I will never suffer again. So, not in this world, but in the hereafter, in the life to come, that there'll be an eternal life for me and everyone who accepts what Jesus has done. So here's the point. You mentioned the word trust. It's such a good word because I can trust that God can use suffering and evil for a greater possible good because God already used suffering, his own, for the greatest possible good there can be, which is the salvation of the whole world. So I trust what God will do based on what God has done. And it is historically verifiable that Jesus died on that cross. And there's great historical reasons to believe he rose from the dead. So I can trust. And no other worldview has this, by the way. Atheism, you know what it tells you? You suffer. Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, says, life is full of meaningless tragedies and meaningless good fortune. And the world and the universe is blind, pitiless, and indifferent. Well, that doesn't give you any comfort.
Yeah, where's the hope in that?
Exactly. But the
Right.
gospel says that God himself, the creator of that universe, does care, is not indifferent, and is full of pity. And not only is he full of pity, but he's full of action. He does something about evil. And he says, I will take it onto myself and deal with it. So I trust what God will do with the suffering I've experienced and the evil that I've been touched by, because he already has done something with suffering and evil at the cross. And so that offers me not just theoretical hope, but historical hope.
Yeah, I love it. Very, very good discussion, Abdu. I think as I was coming to faith and trying to understand things, I remember hearing stuff and like, that sounds good, but so it opens up. Okay, now I have 5 more questions. So I like, again, talk about holding things with an open hand, because I think it's like, okay, I want that to be true, but how do I know that it's true? And so
Right.
we'll be discussing more and more of these things as we get into it. So hopefully people will hang with us, because there's so much more to it, you know, and it's kind of like It's a Wonderful Life again. If you judge it based on, okay, you got a little bit of information, I've heard that, you know, and Christians are such hypocrites or what have you, whatever reason people have rejected Christianity. I hope they hold this with an open hand and continue to listen to our discussions as we grapple with some of these tough questions, you know. But I think there are good answers. And you touched on the resurrection, but I want to talk about that in our next our next session. So
right.
this is very good. Did you say pretty much everything you wanted to say about that? And still, the tricky part is trying to keep these things fairly short so that they're not bite-sized, because you don't want them to be a little bit longer, but at least dig into it enough to where people want to know a little bit more about how we've come to.
No, I'm good. That lands the plane pretty well.
Okay, awesome. We'll move on to the next one.
Okay.
All right. I hope that was helpful for you. Again, trying to keep these around 20 minutes. We could go longer, but I think it's helpful to get some bite-sized chunks of things so you can chew on it and try to think of what you might have for questions. So again, if you have more questions, please leave them in the comments and we'll try to address them in future episodes, whether it's me or Abdu or I'm joined with other guests. I'm trying to understand, and so hopefully you understand that we're all in this together. We need each other, and we're trying to discover some of life's toughest questions, try to answer them, because you're going to have to grapple with these, and you could ignore them if you want, or we grapple with them together and try to figure it out. So, all right, thanks for watching, and God bless you.
Dad, how do I